Clint Eastwood sits still, older now, thinner, his face carved by decades of restraint rather than age. Someone asks a simple question. It is framed politely, carefully. A question about Rob Reiner, a name everyone recognizes, a name that still carries weight. For a moment nothing happens. Eastwood does not rush to answer. He does not smile. He does not deflect. He looks down, then up, as if measuring whether the truth is worth the cost. That pause stretches longer than comfort allows. It becomes the most dangerous part of the exchange. In Hollywood, silence before an answer is rarely accidental. It means a decision is being made. People expect balance. They expect praise softened with distance. They expect the kind of answer that offends no one and protects everyone. This is how the system survives. But Eastwood has reached an age where survival is no longer the point. At 95, there is no career left to protect, no ladder left to climb. There is only identity. When he finally speaks, his voice is steady, not sharp, not bitter, calm in a way that makes the words heavier, not lighter. He does not attack Rob Reiner. He does not question his talent. That would be easy. Instead, he talks about something else entirely. He talks about what Hollywood used to value. He talks about curiosity. He talks about disagreement. He talks about the danger of certainty in art. The shift in the room is immediate, not loud. No one interrupts. No one challenges him. Faces tighten in ways that are hard to notice unless you are looking for them. This is not a scandal. This is worse. It is an exposure. Eastwood is not breaking a rule with anger. He is breaking it with clarity. He explains that his job was never to tell people what to think. His job was to show people who they are. That line lands quietly, but it lands deep. It is not framed as a critique of one man. It is framed as a line between two philosophies, one that asks questions, one that insists on answers. As he speaks, it becomes clear that Rob Reiner is not the real subject. Reiner is a symbol, a marker of a change Eastwood has been watching for years. A change where volume replaced depth, where moral certainty became currency, where disagreement stopped being creative and started being personal. There is no anger in Eastwood's delivery. That is what unsettles the room. Anger can be dismissed. Calm cannot. Calm forces listening. Calm forces reckoning. He does not accuse Hollywood of malice. He accuses it of fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being out of step, fear of letting audiences think for themselves. Someone shifts in their chair. Another looks down at their hands. No one smiles. The silence after his words feels heavier than the silence before them. This is not a debate. There is nothing to argue with. Eastwood has not offered an opinion. He has offered a philosophy shaped by 70 years of watching power move through people. He makes it clear that he is not silenced. He has had his say. That is not the concern. What worries him is the next generation. The ones who feel boxed in before they even begin. The ones who mistake approval for truth. He says fear has never made good art. He says it plainly, without flourish. The question that started this exchange was supposed to be harmless. It was supposed to pass. Instead, it cracked something open. Eastwood has drawn a line without raising his voice. He has said, without saying it directly, that something essential has been traded away. And that trade did not start with Rob Reiner. Reiner just stands on the visible side of it. When the moment ends, there is no release, no laughter, no applause. The room moves on, but something has shifted. Eastwood remains seated, unchanged, as if he expected this outcome all along. At 95, he has chosen not to preserve comfort but to preserve character. What he said cannot be unsaid, not because it was loud but because it was true. And in a system built on careful silence, truth spoken calmly is the one thing no one knows how to respond to. Hollywood has always sold the idea that it is a dream factory, but the people inside it know it runs more like a country with its own laws. On the surface, it looks free. Anyone can speak, anyone can create, anyone can try. Underneath, the real power sits with the people who shape what is acceptable, what is rewarded, and what is quietly punished. That is the world Clint Eastwood grew up inside. He learned early that the work happened in front of the camera, but the rules were written in back rooms, at quiet dinners, in conversations no one recorded. In the old days, when Clint was building his name, the rules were brutal but simple. The studio paid you, so you served the studio. Gossip stayed in the shadows. Politics stayed off the poster. Men in suits decided which actors were bankable and which were finished. You could disagree, but you did it in whispers. A star learned to read the room long before he read the script. You understood that certain opinions could cost you a film, a director, or a future. Survival meant knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Clint never had the loudest voice, so he relied on presence instead. While other people charmed and joked and talked themselves into circles, he sat back and watched. That habit was not just personality, it was self-protection. The quiet man in the corner hears everything and commits to nothing. In an industry built on constant judgment, that kind of distance becomes a shield. He learned that if you did your job well and avoided public fights, the system left you alone. You could carve your own space, as long as you did not embarrass the people who signed the checks. As time moved on, the world around Hollywood changed. The culture outside the gates became louder, sharper, more divided. The business adjusted. Suddenly, silence was no longer the safest choice. Taking a side became a form of currency. The same town that once told actors to keep their opinions out of the papers now encouraged speeches, endorsements, statements. A new kind of power grew, one based not only on box office numbers, but on the image of moral clarity. If you were seen as on the right side, doors opened. If you were not, they did not have to slam. They only had to stop unlocking. In that new order, figures like Rob Reiner rose as more than filmmakers. They became public voices. Directors who once spoke only through their movies spoke now on stages, in interviews, on every screen that would host them. Some did it out of conviction, some out of pressure, many out of both. The lines between art and advocacy blurred. Hollywood did not just reflect the culture. It tried to steer it. The town rewarded the loud, the certain, the unwavering. To many, that felt like progress. To others quietly watching, it felt like a narrowing. Clint Eastwood came from a different school. His films were full of conflict, but they rarely told the audience which side to stand on. He believed that characters should be complicated and that viewers should be trusted. That belief put him at odds with an industry drifting toward stories that announced their message in advance. He kept working, kept directing, kept acting, but the space around him shifted. The old rule had been simple: do not embarrass the studio. The new rule was more subtle and more suffocating: do not step outside the approved conversation. People in Hollywood like to say there is room for every voice. In theory, that sounds true. In practice, the room is smaller than it looks. Agents watch what you say. Publicists measure every sentence. One wrong word can turn into a headline, and one headline can turn into a quiet loss of invitations. No blacklist, no official punishment, just fewer calls, fewer offers, fewer chances. That is how the system keeps itself intact. It does not need to shout. It only needs to make people afraid of missteps. Younger filmmakers grow up inside that fear from the first day they walk onto a set. They follow the examples they see. If the most respected names only speak one way in public, they learn that this is the safe route. They may still have doubts, questions, private disagreements, but those stay locked away. The cost of honesty feels higher than the cost of silence, so they adjust. They write script notes in their heads before they speak in real life. They rehearse sentences even when no camera is rolling. In that climate, someone like Rob Reiner becomes more than a director. He becomes a signpost, a model of how to survive and thrive inside the current rules. He speaks with certainty, and the industry rewards that certainty. Awards shows invite him. Panels quote him. His name carries a kind of approval stamp. To question that path is not just to question one man. It is to question the direction of the whole community. Most people will not do that. They have careers to build and families to support. They tell themselves that keeping quiet is the mature choice. Clint's position is different. He is not waiting for a call. His legacy is already written in box office numbers, in awards, in decades of work that will be studied long after he is gone. That freedom gives him something dangerous in this world, nothing left to trade. He does not need to bend himself to fit the room. At the same time, he is not careless. For most of his career, he followed the unwritten laws like everyone else. He let his films speak where his mouth did not. He understood that a public fight rarely ends with anyone winning. Yet watching the town evolve, he could feel something slip away. Hollywood had always argued about politics in private. It had always leaned, shifted, reacted. That was not new. What was new was the loss of curiosity. Arguments turned into verdicts. Disagreement turned into evidence of character. The question was no longer, what are you trying to say? But which side are you proving you are on? That shift may seem small from the outside. From the inside, to someone who has given his life to the craft, it feels like a betrayal of art itself. The rule everyone knows but no one writes down is simple. If you want peace, do not challenge the system that feeds you. Speak around it. Laugh it off. Give respectful answers when names like Rob Reiner are raised. Call them talented. Call them passionate. Call them anything that keeps the water still. You can think what you like in private as long as your public words fit the narrative. This is how people keep their positions, their deals, their place at the table. At 95, Clint Eastwood sits outside that bargain. He has seen the old studio system, the rebellious wave that broke it, and the careful, curated era that followed. He understands the cost of crossing lines because he has watched others pay it and sometimes paid parts of it himself. When he finally chooses to speak plainly about what troubles him, he is not breaking a single rule. He is breaking the foundation beneath them. In a world that teaches people to protect their future by staying inside the lines, he chooses instead to protect something else. The belief that storytelling loses its soul the moment it is forced to prove it belongs. For most of his life, Clint Eastwood never thought of himself as the one in danger. In his mind, the risk always belonged to the characters on screen, the men who walked into bar rooms they should have avoided, the strangers who took one step too far into someone else's war. He played them, directed them, guided them, then went home and let the world argue about what it all meant. That distance protected him. The stories took the hits while he stayed off to the side, quiet, almost untouchable. Time changed that. As the years leaned heavier on his shoulders, the distance began to close. Somewhere along the way, the roles and the man stopped sitting so far apart. The figures he had put on screen, torn between principle and survival, began to look uncomfortably like reflections. Audiences saw icons. He saw a question that would not leave him alone. What does a man like that do when the real threat is not a fist or a gun, but a choice about what he is willing to say at the end? On paper, Clint Eastwood was beyond risk. His name sat on awards, festival banners, cinema histories. His films were already being studied. Nothing he said at 95 could erase the past work. That is what people told themselves because it made the world feel stable. In reality, the danger had shifted. The risk was not losing a career. It was losing control over the story of who he had been all along. His whole identity had been built on restraint. As a boy, he learned that speaking less kept you safer. As a young actor, he learned that holding back made the camera come closer. As a director, he learned that leaving space for the audience made the work stronger. Each decade added proof that this approach worked. He stayed calm, stayed measured, stayed out of shouting matches. The industry came to see him as a kind of fixed point. You could project onto him what you liked. You could debate his films in 1,000 ways. He rarely joined the argument. That silence became a kind of agreement between him and Hollywood. They would let his work speak, and he would let the system move in whatever direction it wanted without confronting it directly. It was not cowardice. It was calculation. It allowed him to keep making the films he believed in while others argued in front of microphones. The price of that arrangement was simple. You do not say out loud what you really think about the way things are turning. When questions about Rob Reiner started to reach him more often, the old agreement began to strain. Reiner was not just another director. He represented a version of Hollywood that celebrated its own certainty. He spoke loudly and clearly, and the town applauded that clarity. Clint watched all of this and measured it against his own code. He respected the craft. He did not respect the idea that art should be a tool to prove moral alignment. Saying that out loud would cross a line he had stayed behind for decades. Keeping it inside would cross a different one, the quiet line he held with himself. That is where the true risk lived. At 95, he could feel the space between those lines shrinking. Either he would leave the world with a comfortable version of himself, polished and acceptable, or he would accept the cost of being known more honestly than the town preferred. Under the lights, the danger did not look dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. The threat moved in subtler ways. If he spoke plainly, people could reshape his words into something easier to attack. A single remark could be framed as bitterness, as intolerance, as the last gasp of a man out of time. Headlines could turn a lifetime of nuance into a slogan. For someone who had spent years avoiding slogans, that possibility was not small. It was a direct wound to the thing he valued most, being understood through the work rather than through sound bites. There was another layer underneath all of that. With age came a different kind of vulnerability, one that did not show in photographs but lived in quiet hours. He knew there were only so many chances left to say anything at all. Each interview, each conversation, might be the last time he was asked what he thought about the industry that had defined his life. When a final chapter is being written in real time, every sentence carries the weight of a closing statement. If he chose the easy path, he could keep giving safe answers. He could say Rob Reiner was talented, committed, passionate. He could praise the work, sidestep the rest, and no one would have a reason to look closer. That version of Clint Eastwood would pass through his final years as a respected legend who never disturbed the surface. People would keep their fond stories, their simple summaries. The town would breathe easy. Inside, he would know he had let the moment pass. He would know that he had watched something he loved change into something he did not recognize, and he had decided not to say so when it mattered most. The risk there was quieter but sharper. It was the risk of dying as a symbol instead of as a man, surrounded by praise that did not quite fit the truth of how he saw the world. The human at risk in this story is not a young actor, or a silenced writer, or a blacklisted director. It is an old man with a long memory standing at the edge of his own history. His vulnerability does not come from weakness, but from the simple fact that there is no time left to correct a lie of omission. Once he is gone, others will decide what kind of figure he was. They will pick the anecdotes, the quotes, the images. If he has not made his own position clear, the softer version will win. That is the quiet pressure sitting on his shoulders when a question about Rob Reiner reaches him in that room. The people around him see a legend. They do not see the calculation behind his eyes. He is measuring his remaining peace against the need to protect the thing that shaped his entire career. The belief that art should ask, not instruct. The room thinks it is asking about another man. Clint hears something else. He hears a final test of what he truly stands for. The risk is no longer about work. It is about legacy, but not in the grand public sense. It is about what he can live with when the conversation ends and the lights go off. If he chooses comfort, he betrays the restless curiosity that drove his best films. If he chooses honesty, he steps out of the safe silhouette the industry drew around him. Either way, something is lost. That is the edge he walks as he sits there, older than most of the people in the room, steadier than all of them, and more exposed than he has ever been. For the first time, Clint Eastwood is not the man watching danger from the doorway. He is the one standing in it, knowing that the only thing truly at stake now is whether he leaves this world as a carefully preserved myth, or as a flawed, clear-eyed human being who finally refused to let the system finish his story for him. Pressure in Hollywood rarely arrives as a single blow. It seeps in through small openings, through questions that sound harmless and moments that seem routine. For Clint Eastwood, it began with repetition. The same kind of question, brought up in different rooms by different hosts, with the same expectant smile. People wanted him to comment on the new Hollywood, on the loud voices, on the figures who spoke less through their films and more through their interviews. Rob Reiner's name kept floating to the top of those conversations, not because Clint sought it out, but because others put it there and waited. At first he sidestepped, a nod to the past work, a remark about talent, a respectful, vague answer that allowed everyone to move on without discomfort. That is how the system prefers to work. The questions grow sharper, the answers stay soft. Yet each time he slipped away from saying what he really thought, something inside him tightened. The gap between his surface answers and his private beliefs stretched a little wider. That space became its own kind of strain. Rooms changed too. There had been a time when the most dangerous place for an artist was a studio office, where one decision from a man you barely knew could end your chances. Now the threat lived in audiences you never saw, in feeds you never read, in headlines you never wrote. Clint watched younger actors and directors learn to speak in guarded phrases, building sentences like safe houses. They praised the right people in the right way, careful never to leave an opening that could be twisted. It was not hard to see the fear behind the polish. One night he sat at a table during an event that existed mostly for appearances. Awards, tributes, speeches that sounded as if they had been written by the same hand. A young director sat beside him, nervous and eager. The man leaned in and said, almost in a whisper, that Clint's films had shaped everything he wanted to do. There was a glow in his eyes when he said it. Then he added, just as quietly, that he could not say that in interviews because it would confuse people about where he stood. The words were not meant to wound. They did anyway. The cruelty of that moment was not in tone. It was in what it revealed. Clint realized that his name, in some circles, had become less a symbol of craft and more a political signal. People sorted one another by who they cited, who they praised, who they avoided. A career built on moral ambiguity and open questions had been reduced, for some, to a label that others did not dare touch. Listening to that young man explain why he had to hide admiration felt colder than any personal insult could have. An insult is direct. This was erasure. Questions about Rob Reiner continued to circle. In private, people compared the two men as if they were opposite poles of a compass. One represented certainty, the other restraint. One spoke in declarations, the other in stories. Clint did not ask for that contrast. Others imposed it again and again until it began to feel like a demand. Choose a side, approve or object, confirm or deny. There was no room left for the kind of nuance he had lived by. Media moments added another layer. Somewhere, a clip of Reiner speaking passionately about politics would be played, followed by a host turning to Clint's old interviews and wondering out loud what he thought. Articles framed the contrast as a generational divide. Panels debated whether artists had a responsibility to be public advocates. His name was invoked as an example, sometimes as a problem. He had stayed focused on characters and stories, and this restraint now looked to some like avoidance. Behind closed doors, he heard what happened to those who stepped outside the narrow path. A single comment could be lifted out of context and replayed until it hardened into reputation. Colleagues who had spent decades crafting careful work were now known primarily for one remark made on a rushed afternoon. The punishment was never announced. Instead, projects slowed. Invitations thinned. Applause cooled. No one admitted this was deliberate. They did not have to. Silence and distance did the work for them. For a man who had built his life on measured control, this environment felt like a test he had never agreed to take. The world around him kept asking for explicit declarations, and he kept refusing to turn himself into a slogan. Every refusal added to the pressure. It was easier for others if he would just pick a camp. If he praised Rob Reiner without qualification, the room could relax. If he attacked him loudly, a different crowd would cheer. Either way, his complexity would be sacrificed to the comfort of others. A particularly chilling moment came during a private conversation with someone who worked in publicity. They were talking about the way interviews were edited for time. The person mentioned, almost casually, that when older legends said things that did not fit the current tone, the team simply trimmed those parts out. The explanation was framed as protection. No one wanted to see a beloved figure get dragged. The phrase hung in the air like a threat. Protection in this world meant selective mooding. It meant presenting a softened version of you and hiding the parts that did not match the preferred script. Clint walked away from that talk with a realization that did not leave him. If he continued to answer safely, he would not just be avoiding conflict. He would be participating in his own editing. The system would happily preserve a pleasant image of him, as long as he played his part and did not disturb the story it wanted to tell about itself. The trade was simple. Give away your real thoughts and we will give you peace. The pressure reached its peak when an interview was arranged that he knew would bring the same questions yet again. Rob Reiner's name would come up. The state of Hollywood would come up. The temptation to prepare a handful of gentle phrases was strong. He could glide through it, say nothing sharp, leave the room liked and unchallenged. Many people around him suggested exactly that. It would be easier on everyone. In the quiet before that meeting, he sat with the weight of what had been building for years. The young director who could not name him in public, the casual editing of inconvenient truths, the slow narrowing of what could be said without punishment. His own answers, polished and careful, echoed back at him. They sounded less like him each time. A man who had spent his life exploring moral cost on screen now faced his own version of it, stripped of drama but heavy all the same. Gradually, the decision formed. It did not arrive as a burst of anger. It arrived as a refusal to continue cooperating with a story that did not feel honest. He would still remain calm. He would still be fair. He would still respect the work of others. Yet he would no longer pretend that he saw no problem in the direction things had taken. When the question about Rob Reiner inevitably appeared, he would not dodge it with compliments and vague praise. He would answer from the place he had kept quiet for too long. That choice could not be undone. Once he made it, something settled. There would be no clever evasions, no polite misdirection. If the cost was discomfort, then discomfort would have to be paid. If the result was misinterpretation, he would live with it. The line inside him had been crossed long before he stepped into that room. What remained now was simple: carry the decision into the moment when the world finally asked, and accept whatever came after. The room looks ordinary on camera. Neutral backdrop, soft lights, two chairs facing each other at a slight angle, a glass of water on the small table that no one will touch. It could be any interview for any network on any day. That is what makes it dangerous. There is nothing in the frame that warns you a line is about to be crossed. Clint Eastwood sits the way he always has. Spine straight, shoulders relaxed, hands resting without fuss. The years are visible on his face, but there is nothing fragile in his posture. He listens more than he talks. The interviewer runs through the usual ground first. Career highlights, old stories, a gentle joke about age that he lets pass. The air is easy. Crew members on the edge of the set shift their weight, already thinking about the next segment. Then the tone tilts. The interviewer leans forward a little, not too much, just enough to signal a change of subject. He brings up the state of modern Hollywood, the way things have become louder, the way films now compete with speeches. There is a polite chuckle in his voice as he mentions how some filmmakers have turned into constant public commentators. The name Rob Reiner arrives in the middle of that sentence, natural and casual, as if it belongs there. This is the moment Clint knew was coming. He does not blink. He lets the question land in full. It is not framed as an accusation. It is an invitation. The room expects something mild, a nod to Rob's talent, a remark about his success, a safe answer that keeps everyone friendly. Instead, Clint allows silence to fill the space between the question and his response. It is not an absent-minded pause. It is deliberate and heavy. The interviewer smiles and holds it, waiting. A few people behind the cameras glance at each other, then at the floor. They have seen pauses before. This one feels different. It stretches a second longer than comfort allows. When Clint finally speaks, his voice is quiet, even. There is no edge to it, no raised volume. He begins by doing what everyone expected. He acknowledges Reiner's skill as a director. He points to the earlier films that built entire chapters of modern cinema. There is respect in his tone, and it is not forced. For a heartbeat, the tension loosens. It sounds like the usual path. Then he turns. He does not attack the man. He separates the work from what came after. He says there was a time when stories came first, before slogans. He says there was a time when directors trusted their audiences enough not to preach to them. He does not say Rob Reiner betrayed that idea. He does something colder. He suggests that Rob became a symbol of a town that stopped asking questions and started insisting on answers. Words like certainty and virtue leave his mouth with a weight that is hard to ignore. He speaks about how art becomes smaller when it confuses volume with truth. He says he never believed his job was to tell people what to think. He believed his job was to lay people bare. The line draws itself as he talks. On one side, the philosophy he has lived by. On the other, the world that Reiner now represents. The interviewer tries to soften the moment, lightly suggesting that some would say outspoken voices are necessary in these times. Clint listens, then answers without changing his tone. He says fear has never made great work. He says artists should be allowed to be wrong in private without being chased for it in public. He says that when people are more afraid of losing approval than of losing honesty, you stop getting real stories. He does not raise his hand. He does not jab his finger. He does not even shift in his chair. The calmness makes each sentence land harder. Nothing in his delivery suggests spite. That is what makes it impossible to dismiss as bitterness. This is not an old man lashing out. It is a craftsman making a final distinction. Behind the cameras, someone's jaw sets just a little. Another person presses their lips together. No one speaks. The sound engineer glances at the waveform on the monitor, not because he needs to, but because looking anywhere else feels like intrusion. That stillness becomes part of the moment. The line being crossed does not shout. It settles. The interviewer, feeling the room tighten, asks if he thinks Rob Reiner is part of the problem. It is a clumsy question, born more from instinct than malice. If Clint says yes, it becomes a headline. If he says no, it undercuts everything he has just said. He does neither. He cuts through the bait. He says slowly that the problem is not one man. The problem is a system that rewards people who are certain they are right and quietly pushes out anyone who is not interested in taking that posture. Reiner did not build that system, he says, but he is very comfortable in it. The choice of words is surgical. No accusation, yet no escape. In that instant, the break becomes clear. For decades, Clint Eastwood has avoided speaking this plainly about his peers. He kept his judgments to his work. He let characters carry the burden of moral weight. Now, for the first time in a long life under bright lights, he has allowed his own voice to step into the frame. That is the crossing. The unwritten pact of silence between him and the town he came up in is no longer intact. The interviewer senses it. He tries to move on quickly, pivoting to safer ground. Upcoming projects, reflections on aging, the usual closing topics. Clint answers politely, yet something in the energy has shifted. The crew keeps working, but the air feels thicker. Everyone present understands they have just recorded something that will not sit comfortably with everyone who sees it. When the camera is finally cut, there is no outburst. No one storms off. A few people approach Clint with practiced smiles, thanking him for his time. He nods, offers a small, genuine grin, then reaches for the arm of the chair to stand. As he straightens, he looks, for a fraction of a second, relieved. Not triumphant, not satisfied, simply relieved, as if a weight he had carried in silence has finally been set down. Around him, conversations resume in low voices. Some pretend nothing unusual happened. Others keep glancing toward the monitors where the footage will be played back. Editors will later rewind those minutes again and again, listening for a crack in his tone, a hint of malice. They will not find it. The danger lies not in how he spoke, but in what he refused to hide. That is the moral peak of this story. Not a showdown, not a shouted argument, but an old man choosing to put his name, one last time, on the side of uncertainty and curiosity, even if it means standing opposite a powerful current. The line between going along and telling the truth, between being preserved and being real, has been stepped over. There is no way back to the safer version of him that some people preferred. When he walks out of the studio into the fading light of late afternoon, the world outside has no idea what just happened in that quiet room. Cars pass. People check their phones. The city hums along, unchanged. Inside the walls of the industry, though, something is different. Clint Eastwood has finally said aloud what he refused to keep swallowing. In a place that survives on polite avoidance, that simple act of calm honesty is the most dangerous stand he could have taken. The first wave of consequence did not look like backlash. It looked like politeness. After the interview, people thanked him the way they always did. Hands were shaken, jokes were offered, someone told him it was an honor just to be in the room. Only when most of the crew had drifted away did one of the producers step closer and mention, in a careful tone, that the part about Rob Reiner was strong. The word hung between them, praise on the surface, concern underneath. Clint nodded once, as if he had been told the lighting was a little harsh. By the next morning, the shape of it became clearer. His publicist called early, sounding like someone carrying a glass sculpture over a stone floor. They said the segment was good, very good, but there might be some chatter once it aired. A few phrases stood out of context, clipped online, misread tone. None of this surprised him. What did surprise him was the suggestion, delivered gently, that the network might trim a part of his answer for time. He knew what that meant. They were not trying to protect the clock. They were trying to protect him and themselves from the discomfort of the full thought. It would be easy to agree. Let them shave off the edges, sand down the sentence about certainty and virtue, keep the compliment and lose the warning. The safer version of Clint Eastwood could live another day. He listened, then said he did not want it softened. There was a short silence on the other end of the line before the conversation moved on. That was the first small cost. A layer of tension added between him and the people paid to keep everything smooth. When the interview finally aired, the reaction unfolded mostly without him. He did not sit glued to the screen. He saw the broadcast once, then turned it off and went about his evening. The storm happened somewhere else, scattered across screens and feeds and message boards. Old clips of his films were spliced next to new clips of his face. Some voices called him brave. Others called him finished. A few decided he had turned on Rob Reiner, a man he had never claimed to hate. Friends and colleagues relayed pieces of it to him in measured doses. They told him there were people who felt seen by what he said, people tired of the sense that art had become a test of loyalty. They also told him there were plenty who now spoke of him as if he had crossed into enemy territory. The labels slid across his name with ease. Reactionary, relic, angry old man. None of those matched the quiet afternoon he remembered, sitting under studio lights and choosing his words with almost painful care. The public noise did not hurt as much as the private chill. In the weeks that followed, certain calls stopped coming. He had not been chasing work, but people had still called to ask his opinion, to invite him to panels, to place him on advisory boards that mostly wanted his name on a program. Those invitations thinned. Instead of 3 scripts crossing his desk in a month, there might be 1. When awards season talk began, his name was mentioned a little less often in the lists that treat living legends as furniture for the room. No one said he was being pushed aside. The industry simply shifted its gaze a few degrees away. More painful were the shifts in familiar faces. A few old friends reached out quietly, leaving long messages that did not judge. They told him they understood. They told him they had felt the same way but had never said it out loud. Their support landed softly and stayed with him. Others stayed silent. People who had once called often now took longer to respond. When they did, there was a new stiffness, a nervous joke, a need to make clear, without saying it outright, that they admired him but did not necessarily agree. His words had turned him into a line other people did not want to cross. He thought about Rob Reiner more than he admitted. They had not been close, but they had occupied the same universe for decades, crossing paths at festivals and events, sharing the polite affection of men who knew each other's power without needing to say much. After the interview, there was no phone call between them. No note. No message passed through third parties. That absence had its own weight. Clint wondered whether Reiner had watched the clip in full or only seen fragments pulled out of context. He wondered if Rob believed he had been attacked. The thought bothered him, not because he regretted the truth, but because he had always tried to avoid becoming another person who reduced people to symbols. Nights grew quieter. Age already brings a narrowing of the world, and this choice tightened it further. He found himself replaying the interview in his head, not to rewrite it, but to inspect the tone. Had he been cruel without realizing it? Had he pushed harder than he meant to? Each time he arrived at the same conclusion. The words matched what he felt, and the calmness had been real. The unease did not come from guilt over saying it. It came from knowing that saying it had broken the last barrier between his inner and outer life. There were practical costs too. A small project he had been circling with a younger studio simply evaporated. The language in the email was polite, full of talk about shifts in direction and timing. He had read enough of those notes over the years to understand what they meant. Someone higher up had decided that attaching his name at that moment asked for a fight they did not want. He closed the message and did not reply. There was no point forcing honesty out of people who were already afraid. At home, the subject surfaced in gentler ways. During a family dinner, someone mentioned the interview almost in passing. A grandchild said the clip had been everywhere for a day. The younger ones laughed about how fast everything moved now, how today's firestorm became tomorrow's footnote. One of his children watched him carefully, trying to read whether he was hurt. He shrugged it off, said he had lived through worse headlines. That was true on the outside. On the inside, there was a small, persistent ache, not for his reputation, but for the realization that his last public stand might be remembered more as noise than as a plea for a different way of making art. The deepest cost was less visible. For 70 years, films had been his way of wrestling with difficult things without pressing his own thumb on the scale. After that interview, he could never again pretend that his distance from the argument was intact. He had taken a side, not a partisan side, but a philosophical one, and once declared, it could not be folded back into the shadows. People would watch his old movies now with that moment in mind. They would search for confirmation, for signs of the man he had shown himself to be in that quiet room. Some would find what they wanted. Others would ignore what did not serve their story. Clint understood that this was the trade he had made. He had chosen clarity over comfort, and the price was the loss of that clean separation between himself and his work. The world would no longer see only the characters on the screen. It would see the man who said Hollywood had grown afraid of questions. That knowledge sat with him in the late hours, when the house was still and the weight of his years pressed hardest. He did not frame himself as a martyr. He still woke up early. He still went through his small routines. He read. He listened to music. He watched old films that had nothing to do with his own. Life did not collapse around him. It simply felt thinner at the edges. Certain rooms he had once moved through without thinking now felt closed, or at least guarded. The smiles in public were a touch tighter. The compliments carried an aftertaste of caution. That is the real cost of his decision. Not exile, not scandal, a quieter thing. A subtle shift from being an unchallenged monument to being a man some people would rather not be seen standing next to. The sacrifice lived in that space. In accepting it, Clint Eastwood gave up the luxury of being everyone's safe legend and accepted the loneliness of finishing his story on his own terms, knowing that the price of that choice would not be measured in headlines, but in the silence that followed. The moment did not become his most famous scene. It did not overshadow the gunfights, the squints, the lines people had been quoting for half a century. It slipped into the world the way most truths do now, through a link, a clip, a fragment of an afternoon compressed into 90 seconds. People watched it between errands and email. Some barely noticed. Others felt something in it they could not quite name. At first, it lived where everything else lives for a day, on feeds that never stop moving. A short video of an old man talking calmly about fear and certainty in Hollywood joined a stream of noise that was louder and younger than he was. Many scrolled past. A few stopped. Among them were the ones who had grown tired of being told exactly what to think. They listened to the steady voice, to the absence of outrage, to the way he separated one man's talents from the system that now surrounded him, and they recognized a kind of courage that does not wear a costume. Some called it a final speech. That was never what it was meant to be. Clint Eastwood was not interested in summations. He was answering a question as honestly as he could, because he knew there would not be many more chances to do so. Yet as time passed, that quiet answer began to float alongside his films like an unseen caption. Critics who revisited his work heard it echoing underneath the dialogue. Scenes that had always felt morally complicated now carried an extra ounce of weight. People started to say he had been warning them all along about what happens when a world becomes more interested in righteousness than in understanding. The story of that interview did not grow in public through arguments. It grew in smaller places. In film schools, a professor would pause a screening, mention the clip, and ask students what they thought it meant for an artist to refuse easy labels. In cutting rooms where editors shaved scenes down to the frame, someone would bring up the part where he rejected the idea of being protected through trimming. Young directors, tired of polishing their sentences into fear-proof shapes, passed the link to one another late at night with quiet messages that said more than their public statements ever could. For them, his words became less about Rob Reiner and more about permission. Permission to keep asking questions in their work even when the world demanded answers. Permission to live with uncertainty instead of performing virtue for approval. They saw an old man, long past the point of needing anyone's acceptance, choosing to risk his comfort for the sake of the very thing that had made his career possible: genuine curiosity about human beings. In the industry that had once surrounded him, memories shifted. Some would always remember Clint Eastwood as the strong, silent man with the gun. Others preferred to think of him as the director who knew how to let a scene breathe, how to make silence feel heavy. After that interview settled into the collective memory, a different image joined those. An aging figure in a simple chair, refusing to turn another human being into a convenient villain, but also refusing to pretend that nothing had gone wrong. He did not destroy Rob Reiner's reputation. He did not try. That is part of why the moment lasted. Hollywood has seen plenty of public feuds. It forgets most of them as soon as the next scandal arrives. What it rarely sees is someone of his stature deliver a criticism that is both precise and free of malice. That choice created a kind of moral afterglow. You could disagree with him, argue that he was outdated, insist that he misunderstood the times. You could not say he had swung wildly out of anger. The restraint itself became part of the legacy. In his later years, as his body slowed and his circle narrowed, Clint carried that knowledge without ceremony. He did not revisit the interview in public. He did not issue clarifications or apologies. The statement stood as it had been delivered, calm, measured, and final. Friends who visited him sometimes circled around the subject, testing to see whether he regretted it. He would shrug and say something simple like, "You ought to tell the truth at least once," and then change the topic to a piece of music or a scene from an old movie he admired. What lingered for him was not the noise that followed. It was the sense that, in the end, his life on screen and his life off screen had finally lined up. He had spent decades telling stories about people caught between what the world expected and what their conscience demanded. Men who carried secrets until they could not, women who lived with choices that no one else understood. Those narratives had always been safely contained inside fiction. The interview made clear that he had been living that tension himself, holding his tongue because the cost of speech seemed too high. Once he broke that habit, there was a strange peace. He had not blown up the system. Hollywood continued to do what it had always done: adapt, posture, reinvent itself. But he no longer felt complicit in the one bargain that had troubled him most: the agreement to let art be bent towards certainty without saying a word against it. Even if the industry chose not to listen, he could not say he had stayed silent. In the years after his death, when tributes were written and documentaries assembled. The clip from that interview always appeared somewhere near the end. Editors used it as a bridge between the legend and the man. They showed the youth, the middle years, the awards, the late performances, then let his older face fill the screen as he spoke about fear, about questions, about the danger of turning storytelling into proof of belonging. Viewers who had grown up watching him as a near-mythic figure saw, in that final stretch, something more vulnerable and more human. A person who had lived long enough to watch the world change and decided, at the very last, to say how he truly felt about it. The meaning of that moment is not that Clint Eastwood won anything. There were no debates settled, no sides defeated. Its meaning lies in how quietly it redefined what strength looked like in the industry that had first crowned him as a symbol of toughness. Strength was not the ability to dominate a room or crush an opponent. It was the willingness, at 95, to sit under soft lights and say that he would rather make people uncomfortable than tell them they were perfect. That simple admission turned into his final gift to the generations who came after. They did not all agree with him. They did not have to. What mattered was that they saw another way to exist as an artist inside a system that constantly asks for certainty. They saw that you could build a lifetime of work on restraint, then use that same restraint to deliver one clear, unsettling truth when it counted. In the end, his legacy was not just the films, the characters, the awards. It was the line he drew between himself and the world he had helped shape, a line that said stories are meant to open doors, not close them. That quiet afternoon, with its measured sentences and long pause, became the moment that revealed who he had been all along. A man who believed that power is loud, but character rarely needs to be.